Welcome to Podcast to Connect. If you are using a podcast or want to use a podcast to find your people and make connections with them, whether it be for business or community purpose, then this is the place for you. Hi, I'm Steph from Coffee Like Media, and I've been podcasting for quite a while. And I have definitely grown my community and my business, both from podcasting as well as supporting mediums like newsletters and YouTube channels. And we'll talk all about that, don't worry. But I wanted to share some of the things that I have learned throughout the years, as well as some of the conversations I'm having with people about the different things we're doing to connect to folks in the podcasting space and what glorious things come out of those connections. In this first season, I'm repurposing episodes from earlier versions of Podcast to Connect, one of which was a 30-day experience called National Podcast Post Month, where a bunch of editors came on to the podcast and gave tips and advice on how to maneuver your podcast to sound good. And then it grew from there into more of the connective and outreach and community focus of podcasting. I've taken a smattering of both of those flavors, and here are a few of those that I think give you a variety, a bouquet, a rainbow, shall we say, of different tips that I think will help your business or community podcast. If you need help with your podcast, feel free to reach out to me at coffeelikemedia.com. All right, let's get on with today's tip. All right. Well, that's where the happiness ends, because we were chatting a little bit before we pressed record, and we hit a moment of creative pain with your podcast, with connections. And I want to start there because I think that's a pain that a lot of people have. Can you describe the dissatisfaction that you? I
sure can. Absolutely. So my podcast is currently called Roll Factory. It is a tabletop role-playing game podcast, mostly focused on Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Mm-hmm. And the concept was that I was going through the character sheet one number at a time and having a guest come on to do a short scenario explaining what that number was. So if you wanted to learn how to roll an attack or how to save yourself from danger using a specific statistic, you'd be able to listen to that episode and in 10 minutes get an explanation and an example to help you understand how to do that. And it's a lot of fun. I basically get to be a dungeon manager for a short scenario. Nice. But I realized that at some point, the amount of collaboration, the amount of engagement with the guest wasn't quite where I wanted it to be. And what helped me realize that was that I was having trouble sitting down to create episodes. It was more of a slog than I wanted it to be. And the reason that the sort of explanation that I eventually came up with was that I really do thrive in a more collaborative environment. I like back and forth. I like bouncing ideas around and having the nearly sole responsibility of coming up with the scenario and laying it out for the guest wasn't as creatively engaging as I wanted it to be.
Right. Like, how did you know that there was a connection that would be better than the one you were having? Like, what were you comparing it to outside of the podcast?
Sure. I think there are two levels of comparison. One of them is just personal, from having had conversations, not as often as I'd like to, but having conversations with other people who write and run games and being able to say, hey, I had this idea for this scenario. Like, I want to run this mystery, but I don't know exactly what the clues I should leave are. Or I have this idea for a monster, but it seems like it might be underpowered for the level of the party. And so I want to make it more dangerous. How do I do that? And having those conversations is really fun for me. And then a sort of more public comparison, there are lots of shows that do kind of behind the scenes that do here is advice for role-playing game masters and players, or that do like, here are things you can use in your game, or that are behind the scenes kind of dissecting and reviewing episodes of actual play shows. So they'll play the game and then they'll go back and they'll talk about what was it like to be involved in the story. And so there are lots of examples of that much more collaborative idea bouncy model out there. And I find myself thinking about why I find those shows appealing. It is cool to get a glimpse behind the scenes, but it also really is very collaborative and shared. And that appealed to me pretty strongly.
Yeah. Yeah. What were some of the examples of the shows that had that level of bounciness? I love that term also.
Probably my favorite is actually a web video series called Dimension 20. It's published by Dropout. Brendan Lee Mulligan is the game master for most of those games, and they do something called Adventuring Party. So they will basically they shoot all their seasons shoot their season in a block, and then as each episode drops, they'll have an Adventuring Party episode where they come in having just watched back the most recent episode that's published, and then the players and the GM talk about it. Which is really fun. There's also there's another project that Brendan Lee Mulligan does with Erika Ishii, Ebria Iyengar, and Lou Wilson called Worlds Beyond Number. That is a podcast where they do the same thing. They'll release an episode one week, and then the next week for their patrons they have what's called their fireside chat, where they again review the most recent episode, talk about the choices that they made, talk about the way the story developed, and so they talk about it both from a game perspective and sort of from an acting perspective, and talking about the role playing. And both of those are favorites of mine.
That's really fun. Those ones that they're doing, like the talking about it afterwards. Are they doing that live, or is that recorded and then released?
They are pre-recorded. Although they're a lot more lightly edited than the actual play shows.
Right. That's what I was thinking.
But there are. It's a good question. I would be willing to bet there are some shows that do that live. I'm not aware of any. There were probably also sort of fan casts that will dissect an episode live, but I'm not aware of any off the top of my head.
Right. Have you ever done your episodes live?
No. No is the short answer. Yeah. No. I've done some stage stuff in my day a million years ago, but no, I've never done a podcast recording live.
Oh, I love the fact that we're not doing it right now. Probably it goes against what I'm about to say, but I absolutely love it. The stuff that happens in the chat room once you get the community over in there, it makes it a completely different not completely different, but brings out a lot more of the natural conversation and the folks that are actually talking in the episode. It's really fun. I mean, it takes a while to get used to looking at the chat room and keep it going and that kind of thing. But that's always been my hesitation, is it pulling the focus away from the person I'm talking to versus stuff coming in from the chat.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm completely misremembering. I wasn't the host, but the first podcast that I got involved with used to be recorded live because it was also a radio show. At the time, this was in 2010. It was called Skeptically Speaking. It has since rebranded to Science. Great name. Yes, I was started as a fan and ended up volunteering. They've since changed their name to Science for the People, and so it's sort of science. It's conversations about science with scientists and science writers and journalists and that kind of thing. But it's no longer produced live. But in the beginning, it was, because it was airing first on a college radio station in Edmonton, Alberta, and so they would do the interview live, and then at various points we did experiment with having chat. But there was always, I wasn't hosting, so there was always somebody who was, most of the time I was monitoring the chat and then sending, I was sort of screening questions and sending them to the host. So I have been involved in a live podcast recording back, which, I mean, 2010 in podcasting years is practically
a long time ago. Yeah.
I guess I have been involved in that, and it's completely forgotten.
I have done some things where it was really important for me to stay focused, and I would tell people at the beginning, "Hey, I'm going to look at the chat room afterwards, and then I can answer the questions then." So I vacillate back and forth between which method to use depending on what is happening live. But there's a lot of different ways you can do it if that were of interest. What I find is that a lot of the times they're talking to each other. They don't even need the people that are talking here to be in the chat room. It's just like another little community, another community for people to connect to each other. That's different.
Gotcha. Yeah. And community among listeners is super important.
Exactly. It's a connection that we sometimes forget about, that people that like the stuff we're doing want to talk to each other too, because it's a like interest.
Sure.
So you were dissatisfied with it because it didn't have the bounciness and the connectivity, and you've changed it, including the name. What's the new name again?
The new name is Adventure Capital.
Capital. Okay. And you've recorded 1 or 2 new episodes? I
have recorded some test episodes. I have potential co-hosts lined up, and I have some potential guests. But yes, nothing published yet. I have a landing page at adventurecapitalpod.com. Where people can go and check out what the new format is going to be and what to expect. But so far, no new episodes.
Okay. So the tests, how are they going?
They're going well. They're going well.
Are they bouncy?
They are. Yes, there's definitely much more of it is much closer to the vibe I want. It's we each have our own ideas and we share them and refine them, and it is much more engaging and feels. I just also I'm not naturally inclined to the spotlight, which is weird coming, I'm sure, from somebody who has volunteered to be interviewed, but I just am, I'm much more comfortable with a focus where I'm sharing the attention.
Right. The vast majority of the podcasters I've met are introverts, so I'm not surprised at all. But I think listeners might be, because I think there's still the perception of if you put yourself out there, you must be a very, very extroverted person. It's like, no, this is just a safe space that I can then close my computer down and go away by myself.
Yes. Yeah. Having it be very discreet and controllable is definitely my jam.
Definitely. So how would you describe the main differences that you've noticed? I know it's not too many tests so far, but in the test so far, what has been the biggest shift for you?
It feels much less like I'm coming to the table and saying, okay, here's what we're going to do, and then guiding the guests through it. Which there's still a little bit of that because I am the person who has the format in my head and knows what I'm looking for. Yeah. But the execution of it is much more, hey, here's my idea, let's bring them together, let's shoot it around. And so, it is much more collaborative. It's also a little bit more spontaneous. The folks the guests in the Roll Factory episodes didn't know a ton about the scenario before they started. So it was, other than what role they were going to be performing. And so, that was also fairly spontaneous, but this I think is even more, and there's just that energy about it.
Is there anything else you're still tweaking with the format that isn't quite right yet in the tests?
Everything is open for tweaking, because I think that, again, a lot of this came out of my just feeling creatively like it wasn't exactly where I wanted to be, and so I'm giving myself permission, and this is something I tell my podcasting clients, is that I'm giving my permission to sort of treat it like a comic book rather than a novel, where each episode has the opportunity to experiment with art styles and lettering choices and all, you can, with panel layouts and you can play with each individual episode. And I think it still has to connect thematically, but it's not like a novel where you have to have generally at least, where you have to have a consistent style and a narrative through line that runs all the way from page 1 to page last, right? So I'm giving myself permission to experiment and change things up if something doesn't feel like it's how I want it to go. I'm giving myself permission to experiment.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Podcast to Connect. I'll have all of the information in the show notes or video notes, depending on where you are consuming this. Again, Podcast to Connect is available in audio and video format. And if you need any help with your podcast, feel free to reach out at coffeelikemedia.com. Thanks so much. Bye.